Hello guys, welcome back. I'm going to read the rest of the book I was looking at, Britain, the Key to World History by Comyns Beaumont. It's quite an interesting book, I've got to say. He's got some good hypotheses, I suppose. To cut a long story short, so far what I've picked up, the author, what he's trying to imply or hypothesize, that the Bible is based on a story about an ancient race of people that lived Northern Europe, kind of like in Atlantis, and these people got moved by a catastrophic event, moved south. And I think the author is implying that characters from the Bible are actually people from Britain that moved from Shetland to Avebury, and all the different locations in the Bible are actually places in England. It's interesting. I've got to say it's interesting. It kind of follows up what I've been looking at. There was a place, it was called Doggerland, that was covered up by the ocean, and it's real. It's a real place. It's not like these flat Earth fantastical tales. This has actually been proven that there was land between Britain and France and Holland connecting. It was called Doggerland. Now it's covered in the ocean, and they reckon there was a giant landslide from Norway that caused it. A giant one that caused a tsunami. So there is proof, there is evidence that there was a catastrophic event thousands of years ago that changed Britain and Western Europe. But the guy's on a sort of Atlantis approach, and fair enough. There's another thing that ties in with what I'm interested in. The Celtic, I believe the Celtic culture began in the British Isles, in Northern Europe, and spread throughout Europe, spread east. The normal sort of thinking is it started in Central Europe and spread to the British Isles, but I think it went the other way around. I think it started in Northern Scotland and spread, because the whole of Britain was Celtic at one point, and there still is large traces of the Celtic language and culture in Scotland and Ireland and Wales. I can't see, in the genetics as well, I can't see how it could have came from Austria. But anyway, I'm kind of digressing. I just want to get on with this book because it is a big one. And there's quite a few interesting, if anything, it sparks imagination. It sparks imagination, and there is a lot of archaeological truths to it, because as I've been reading the book, I've been looking at certain things, and this guy wrote this book in 1938. Was it 1938? I think it was published in 1948. I could be right, 48, something like that. Could be wrong. But it was a long time ago, so this is an old book, and the discoveries they're finding about Doggerland, and these are quite new discoveries, and a lot of the things that he's saying in the book that he's quite right. Like, there is a lot of connections there, but I'm not too sure about the Bible. I'm not 100% about the Bible, but there could be, like, I was looking at the hypothesis of the Exodus, the tribes in the Exodus being Celts. Hebrews were actually Celts. It was the Romans that called the Celts Celts. The Celts didn't call themselves Celts. They called themselves Hebrew or Iberi. And they reckon it's like that comes from Hebrew. So there's this sort of movement I've noticed on the internet as well, on YouTube. I don't totally agree, but they think the tribes of Israel got banished and then populated throughout Europe. But what if it was the other way around? What if the original story of the tribes started in Britain and then they spread out the other way? Just like the Celtic culture. I believe the Celtic culture spread from Britain throughout Europe, and I think it could be the same with that. There's a lot of stuff we don't really know, guys, and I know this is going to kind of hurt the feelings of a lot of Bible people, but we might as well look at it, because this guy, Comyns Beaumont, dedicated his life to this, and he never took a biased approach, like a fanatical religious approach to it. So what I've been reading so far has been interesting, to say the least. I'm not saying it's all true, but it does make you, it does spark the imagination, make you go into other fields of research, and it's quite enjoyable, actually. Anyway, I'm going to continue reading the book. Hope you are having a good night. Like I said, I'll do a wee bit of research in between reading, if we see certain names or certain people. I've already picked out a few. Oh, guys, you're going to like this one as well. I found this is what I like about this book. It got me looking at the Western Islands in Scotland, and it's funny because within the flat Earth, they believe that there's like a Mount Meru or something like that, like a magnetic mountain. And funnily enough, in the Western Hebrides in Scotland, there's a hill called Comyns Hill on an island called Canna, on this little island in the Western Hebrides called Canna, Canna, like Canaanite. Funny that, Canna. But this hill, Comyns Hill, it's really magnetic. When ships go past it, it messes with the compasses. Instead of pointing north, it points to this hill on this island. So it's called Comyns Hill because it messes. It's fully a volcanic. What's it called? I think it's tuff. It's called tuff. It's volcanic material, but it's packed with iron. So it just messes with compasses, and I just thought it rang bells with the Mount Meru. I'll let you have a wee look at it, actually. Right. Let's see. Here it is here. Canna, this little island in the Western Hebrides. This is what I like. It's like I start digging into research about places in my own country I didn't even know about. So it says here about Canna, Scotland. Canna, Scottish Gaelic, Cannae, Aileen, Chanae, is the westernmost of the small Isles archipelago in the Scottish Inner Hebrides. It is linked to the neighbouring island of Sanday by a road and sandbanks at low tide. The island is 4.3 miles long and 1 mile wide. The isolated skerries of Highscare and Humla lie 6.2 miles southwest of the island. The islands were left to the National Trust for Scotland by their previous owner, the Gaelic folklorist and scholar John Lorne Campbell, in 1981, and are run as a farm and conservation area. Cannon House has one of two big houses on the island, the other being Tigard, contains John Campbell's important archives of Gaelic materials that were donated with the islands to the nation. Since then, the NTS is engaged in new initiatives to attract new residents and visitors of the island. Right, so the interesting bit. Load of facilities, wildlife. Right, here it is here. Canna is noted for its tiers of basalt pillars that rise over the eastern half of the island and the sea cliffs that dominate its northern shore. The highest point on the island is Carnegail, Gaelic for Rocky Hill of the Storm, at 689 feet, 210 metres. Another point of interest is Comyns Hill. Its peak is at 456 feet, 139 metres, and sits on the eastern edge of the island. It is made of a volcanic rock called tuff, and it has such a high iron content that the compass of nearby ships are distorted, pointing to the hill rather than north. So that's quite an interesting one, guys. A magnetic hill. Here's some of the prehistory. Canna is littered with numerous pottery sherds, evidencing the island's occupation in the Neolithic era, along with a small number of mysterious cellars dug in the ground. A distinctively shaped standing stone is found at Cale, around which a local legend has grown. According to the legend, when people in Canna were badly behaved, they would be punished by having their thumb jammed into a particular hole in the stone. at about 6'4" above ground level, hence the stone's name, the Punishment Stone. So it's an ancient island. There's old ruins here that goes way back. Way back. People were living on these islands. So there's definitely evidence of life on this part of the world. Anyway, the book. Back to the book. I just thought that would be a nice wee point of interest for you. And here's Doggerland. This is a National Geographic article. And you can see here that 16,000 BC, this really light green area, this was all land. This was all connected to France and the Netherlands, Denmark, this whole area. In 8,000 BC, this light green disappears, but Britain was still connected to the Netherlands and Belgium by the dark green. So 7,000 BC, the dark green was still there, so this was still connected. And today, it's obviously, we've got the English Channel created, the North Sea. This Dogger Bank still exists today. It's like a shallow part of the North Sea. And it's actually important for marine life and stuff like that. I kind of researched into it. It says here, at the end of the last ice age, Britain formed the northwest corner of an icy continent. Warming climate exposed as a vast continental shelf for humans to inhabit. Further warming and rising seas gradually flooded low-lying lands. Some 8,200 years ago, a catastrophic release of water from a North American glacial lake and a tsunami from a submarine landslide of Norway inundated whatever remained of Doggerland. So, and fishermen have found remains of mammoth bones, they found lion bones, they found all sorts, rhinoceros. They found rhinoceros at this area. I think they've found Neanderthal bones as well in this area as well. So this was a much larger piece of land before some kind of catastrophic event happened. And who knows, was this the Atlantis that they talk about? The old Greeks. Right, I was at 139, but I'll just start on the page before, just at the bottom. In these circumstances, it is not in the least surprising that the judicious Diodorus identifies Osiris with Dionysus, the serpent god. A serpent, also born mythologically in a cave, as also with Serapis, Seraph, another symbol of the same science. He says, to Osiris they gave the invention of ivy, which was also consecrated to him by the Egyptians, as by the Greeks to Dionysus. In the ceremonies and sacrifices, ivy was preferred before the vine, because the same loses its leaves and other abides continually green. Osiris is sometimes named Serapis, at other times Dionysus, Pluto, Ammon, Jupiter, and by others Pan, and many think that Serapis is the same whom the Greeks term Pluto. So, I thought, who's this character Dionysus? We'll have a look at Dionysus. Here's Dionysus here, guys. Dionysus is the god of the grape harvest, winemaking and wine, of ritual madness, fertility, theatre and religious ecstasy. In ancient Greek religion and myth, wine played an important role in Greek culture, and the cult of Dionysus was the main religion focus for its unrestrained consumption. His worship became firmly established in 7th century BC. He may have been worshipped as early as 1500 to 1100 BC by Mycenaean Greeks. Traces of Dionysian-type cult have also been found in ancient Minoan Crete. His origins are uncertain, and his cults took many forms. Some are described by ancient sources as Thracian, others as Greek. In some cults, he arrives from the east as an Asiatic foreigner, and others from Ethiopia in the south. He is a god of epiphany, the god that comes, and his forgiveness as an arriving outsider god may be inherent and essential to his cults. He is a major popular figure of Greek mythology and religion, becoming increasingly important over time, and included in some lists of the 12 Olympians as the last of their number and the only god born from a mortal mother. His festivals were the driving force behind the development of Greek theatre. The earliest cult images of Dionysus show a mature male, bearded and robed. He holds a fennel staff, tipped with a pine cone, and known as a thyrsus. We'll have a look at what these thyrsus is. So a thyrsus, or a thyrsos, was a wand or staff of a giant fennel, covered with ivy vines and leaves, sometimes wound with tenai and always topped with a pine cone. Symbolism. The thyrsus associated with Dionysus or Bacchus and his followers, the satyrs and maenads, as a symbol of prosperity, fertility, hedonism, and pleasure enjoyment in general. It has been suggested that this was specifically a fertility phallus, with the fennel representing the shaft of the penis and the pine cone representing the seed issuing forth. The thyrsus was tossed in the Bacchic dance. Pentheus, the thyrsus, in the right hand shall I hold it, or thus am I more like a bacchanal. Dionysus, in thy right hand and with thy right foot raise it. Sometimes the thyrsus was displayed in conjunction with the cantharos wine cup, another symbol of Dionysus, forming a male and female combination like that of the royal scepter and orb. So guys, when you see this pine cone, and you hear a lot on YouTube about symbology and stuff like that, it's always the pineal gland. They're trying to stop people finding out about the pineal gland, because it's a pine cone, and when really it's not. The pine cone is really just a phallic symbol. The pine is known as conifer in the genus Pinus. So you kind of know where the word penis now comes from. Pinus, the pine cone. Pine cone is a phallic symbol, guys. It's nothing to do with your fucking this new age third eye rubbish. This is what the pine cone really represents. And I think it was a druid. I think this really came from a druid. So I'm saying that they don't know really where this person came from. They've got him as this sort of female typed male, but really he was meant to be some old dude in a robe with a wand. So it sounds to me he was more like a druid or a wizard. And I'm not sure where he came from. Anyway, I'm starting to digress again. Sorry guys. I'll get back to the book. But we just need to understand some of these characters that he's talking about. Diodorus' words amount to this, namely that the secret practice of the infernal deities and all they portended was utilised long ago on a great scale. Diodorus did not apparently realise what this ancient devotion signified, for the secret had been lost or was concealed long before the beginning of the 1st century AD. The writer of the Book of Enoch comprehended, however, when he reported the words of the angel of peace as he conducted Enoch to that very region of the west which he describes as paradise and the Garden of Eden, to the very region, in fact, of Avalon, where the patriarch was shown the Santonites manufacturing weapons on a gigantic scale. All these things which thou hast seen shall serve the dominion of his anointed, that he may be potent and mighty on the earth. In the original Egypt, nay, in this same region, as we have seen, the Pitta providing the key, may we identify the true heart or core of this occult industry, whose real practices were obscured from the vulgar by arcane rites and severe ceremonies. It was held to be sacred quest, and Memphis was the city where, according to Plutarch, stood the tomb of the good man Osiris, and also that of Isis. He had been a mortal king, as Isis had been a queen, but the murder of Osiris by Set was reputed to have occurred near Memphis, and there was a legend that on the Tanatic branch of the Nile, which flowed into the deep near Tanis, otherwise the city of Dan, our town of Taunton, or nearby, the body of Set or Typhon floated out to sea. In this, the Tanatic mouth answers to the river Parrot, of so many names in the past. So the author's here, he's connecting like Avebury and Bath, all these different places in the Bible, in Egypt. I suggest that in the foregoing, the fate of Osiris and his murder by Set, the celestial serpent, is an etherealized version of the fate of the traditional King Arthur, who was slain by his rival Modred on the banks of Camlan, believed to have been the river Camel, whence he was taken to Avalon, died there, and was buried, although his spirit survived. If I am not mistaken, Arthur's period was that immediately preceding the Great Catastrophe. In the mystical career of Arthur, which comes down from very early times in veiled allusions, we find a strangely similar aspect comparable to the ascribed to Osiris, in respect of which I am indebted to the researches of Mr. Lewis Spence. Significant in this aspect is a bardic poem known as the Spoils of Anwen, the Cymric name for Hades, which relates to a visit paid to the nether regions by Arthur and his company, ostensibly to rescue Gwyr ap Gersin, who had attempted the journey and had been imprisoned there, but was actually a pretext to visit the underworld in the region of Avalon. Spence says it is similar to another poem entitled The Harrowing of Hell, which describes a descent into the abyss to carry away its secrets and treasures. Professor Rees says that the principal treasure carried away by Arthur was the cauldron of the head of Hades, or Pwyll. The explanation of these mysterious visits to the underworld plainly relates to the Masonic initiations. Freemasonry is of extreme antiquity and was practiced on both sides of the Atlantic long before the flood, behind which mystifications the true purpose was evidently the initiation of King Arthur himself into the innermost secrets or developments of the Kibiri gods after he had undergone certain rites and ceremonies in some underground crypt. For the mention of the cauldron contains the clue to the intention. Furthermore, behind it all, the true motive was by means of magic, to acquire power and domination. Anwen, or Hades, says Spence, was sometimes a horrible abyss, at others a germinating place for life, and yet again as a dim region not unlike this world and bearing resemblance to Avalon. The goddess Ceridwen, or Ceres, Queen of Hades, the British Isis, prepared a cauldron in Anwen, round which came below flames played. Closely involved in this test was an arcane druidic fraternity called the Feralt, who were associated with the rites of the cauldron. The word feral means iron, so they were sorcerers in the same uses of iron for certain purposes, and the cauldron will signify the smelting of it in some form. In the forest of Dean, many centuries ago, miners worked deep subterranean passages called skills in order to extract the iron ore, and to this day yew trees hedges still mask the entrances to prehistoric workings suggestive of Kibiri secrecy. It was originally known as Ferilog, the place of iron. It is not difficult to assess the object of Feralt or Feralt Brotherhood in its underworld traffic, who, Spence says, were a branch of Druidism, teachers and scientists skilled in all that necessitated the agency of fire, whence the name has been equivalent to the alchemists or metallurgists, their handiwork being known as the arts of Feralt. He believes their headquarters were in the mystic city of Emrys, in the district of Mount Snowdon, known as Dinas Afaron, or the higher powers, but which might be translated also as the city of Pharaoh. This caste employed the cauldron of Kedawin, in which the elusive bard Taliesin remarked significantly, "It would not boil food for a coward." I fervently wish that such occult references were appreciated at their true value. Doubtless, seeing the significance of the foregoing, it would not. Behind all the mysticism lies, I suggest, certain Masonic initiations into black magic, conducted in tunnels or caverns, into which King Arthur was introduced, like Osiris. The same system shown the initiation of a king or chief into the magic or serpent rod comes from Palenque, Mexico, a former great city. The Popol Vuh is full of such magical indications. Powell is another mystical figure in the Celtic underworld, who is one of the legends of the Mabinogion, is Prince of Dyfed or Pembroke, and changes places with the devil himself for a year. Powell indeed rejoices in various names and is able to assume many forms, while among his possessions is the castle of the Grail of Cauldron, and an ancient bardic poem entitled Cadair Ceredwen, or the Chair of Ceredwen. The hero Peredur visits his mystical underworld castle, and another entitled The Conte de Graal. Peredur is expected to put a certain vital question to the Fisher King, who is lame, this being, "Unto whom serveth of the Grail?" Peredur fails to ask this question, which would have released the Fisher King from his mystical dumbness, and would have permitted him to pass on the translation of the secret words, and thus have dispelled the enchantment of Britain. I venture to think that this also may be explained by an understanding of the true nature of black magic, and perhaps has an historical meaning. The Fisher King is more obvious. Professor Rees, citing from the story of this mysterious personage, remarks, "Much knew he of the black art, more than 100 times changed he his semblance." Spence reveals his identity. In the first place, the ruler of Hades is frequently lame, and Hephaestus, Wayland Smith, and even the medieval Satan show this deformity. Powell, the Fisher King, is indeed the grand black magician of the underworld, who still has the means of fertility, inspiration, and regeneration in his mystical cauldron. For my part, I cannot allot to Powell's so illustrious a plane as Mr. Spence accords to him. Hephaestus, Wayland Smith, Satan, and Ptah all represent a purely materialistic creation or symbolic phase of divinity of an infernal character with possible slight deviations to suit the genius of the different peoples. The Greco-Phoenician Hephaestus, for instance, was traditionally thrown down from the Olympus by Zeus and was accordingly lamed, but having reached the earth he burrowed in tunnels and under burning mountains on islands like Lemnos, where his satellites manufactured metalwork and arms. Ptah differed only slightly, but the principle was the same in all these instances, the intention being to individualize him as the dominating genius of the underworld, using lightning or fire as his medium of creation and destruction. If, as I opine, the bardic legends relate to Masonic initiations in what Professor Rees terms the Black Art, the Fisher King, or Ptah or Powell, was represented by the Hierophant or Master of Ceremonies at inner initiation rites, masquerading as Ptah, and held that position probably for a year. Consider with these very secret assignations in the bowels of the earth, those deep crypts mysteriously used by certain druids, the fraternity of the Feralt, the magicians working in iron, a cauldron which boils something most obscure but not food for a coward. Surely, therefore, the implication lies at hand. If the product were not for cowards, it infers, contrawise, that the result required brave men, heroes, warriors, and who were these alchemists other than the Kabiri gods or Cyclops? And what was the abyss or the subterranean place of Hades but one of those underground Kabiri temples which Herodotus describes as built underground? Surely the art was producing explosives. So this is what the author he believes this black magic was a weapon, an ancient weapon of explosives. The heart of this activity or science appears to have been centred in Avalon. Although we may believe that there were many actual scenes of Kabiri workshops, as in the forest of Din and Dinas Afaron, in the Cassiderides Isles, and elsewhere too, as to Avalon we have the evidence of the Pile villages, and it is possible extensive excavations under the base of the Tor might produce results. At all events, we find in another direction close resemblances between King Arthur and Osiris, both of whom were subsequently deified, and both were made periodical visits to the underworld or Hades for obscure but most important reasons. Spence makes the following comparison between the two god kings. When Arthur is slain by his treacherous nephew Mordred, he is carried off in a bark by his sister to the mysterious isle of Avalac or Avalon. There he remains, neither alive nor dead, awaiting the fateful day when Britain shall require his sword. The history of Osiris has many points of resemblance with that of Arthur. When slain by his treacherous brother Set, the body of the Egyptian god was ferried in the sacred bark across the Nile to the regions of Alu in the west. The older traditions of King Arthur bear many characteristics like those attributed to the pharaohs, and especially of those relating to Sesostris, who, it would seem, was actually the same king as Amenophis, the last king of the 19th Ramses dynasty, according to the Manetho. In the Mabinogi of Powell Pedavig David, we find Arthur lauded as adorable potentate, sovereign ruler, who hast extended thy dominion over the boundaries of the earth, and whose sword stretched from Scandinavia to Spain. Sir John Mallory, in his Morte d'Arthur, described him as King of Dacia, Gaul and Britain. These are proud boasts to make, and we have to consider whether they were rhetorical and exaggerated claims or whether they were based on reality. They did not certainly relate to some King Arthur who is said to have lived in the 6th century AD and who fought bravely but vainly against the invading Saxons. In the Mabinogion collection of legends and mythological tales, very ancient and mystical in character, Arthur was a suzerain prince and among others the King Lot of the Orkneys, whose son Sir Gareth and Sir Gawain attended his court. That may throw a considerable clue to the age of the real Arthur, for it is scarcely a name thrown carelessly into the legends, and such being the case, it infers, if no more, that the sway of Arthur spread afar and included the Orkney Isles, if not the Shetland Isles. Lot's name is preserved in the name of the Lothian Hills near Edinburgh, and we have additional evidence of the Scottish sovereignty of Arthur in such place names as Arthur's Seat at Edinburgh, as Arthur's Stone near Angus and Arthur's Own Oven near Falkirk, the latter town formerly named Camelon, an Arthurian name. The oven itself destroyed by an ignorant and grasping laird only some 2 centuries back, a most curious round building of the great strength where the Knights of the Round Table were reputed to have met. So that's true as well, that there's a hill here called Arthur's Seat. It's a volcanic hill in the middle of my city called Arthur's Seat. And it's interesting stuff. These legends spreads far and wide. In the Arthurian cycle of his adventures, the hero king led the Britons across the seas to make war on the Roman emperor in the Cisalpine Gaul. But this is manifestly a later invention, for the original Arthur lived centuries before Rome was even dreamt of. He has said that he bears many characteristics in common with the great pharaoh Sesostris, who left his country on an overseas adventures and made his relatives Armaeus act as his regent during his absence, and as also did Arthur, which Armaeus seduced his queen as Modred seduced Guinevere, and both Armaeus and Modred attempted to usurp the throne. Sesostris, informed of the grave state of affairs when fighting against the Scythians, hastened home, leaving his conquest incomplete, and avenged himself against Armaeus. Arthur also was engaged in foreign conquests, returned home, his conquests uncompleted, and fought battles against Modred, the crucial battle being at Camlan, generally identified with Cabaret Castle, the ancient prehistoric fortress about 12 miles southeast of Glastonbury, with a trackway between the two called King Arthur's Ride, Leyland describes it as sometimes a famous town or castle, and says much gold, silver, and copper coins were found there in the 16th century with other antique relics. Unhappily, such invaluable clues to the past were doubtlessly sold and melted down. Traditionally, Arthur was carried to the Isle of Avalon and was transported across the water by the mysterious Vivian, Lady of the Lake, and the other goddesses to that sacred city. Sesostris says Manetho, as cited by Josephus, was most famed for his foreign conquests by land and sea, vanquishing Phoenicia, the Assyrians, and Medes, some by his arms, some without fighting, and some by the terror of his great army and being puffed up by the great successes he had. He went on still the more boldly and overthrew the cities and countries that lay in the eastern parts. Herodotus says that Sesostris first proceeded in a fleet of ships by the Etherean Sea, subduing nations until eventually he reached a sea non-navigable by reasons of shoals. He returned to Egypt and the following year collected a vast army and made himself master of Thrace and Scythia. Thrace and Dacia were one and the same, and I indicated in my previous work that the Thracians were of the same origin as the Caledonians, and that Scythia was represented by the northern Russia east of Vistula, signifying that Sesostris went to the Baltic on this war of conquest. So did traditionally Arthur. In this expedition, continues Herodotus, Sesostris erected pillars of stone called Osiri pillars in the subjected lands, using upright stones where the nations had been subdued only by the might of his arms, and of another kind, representing the feminine sex, where they submitted without fighting. They were apparently phallic symbols, like the linga and lingam of the Hindus, and were probably erected as religious emblems. Herodotus adds that he engraved his name and country on these monoliths, and it is interesting to note that the Elgese in the archaeology of Yorkshire describe certain stone monuments of the Bronze Age in Yorkshire of the very similar character to those attributed to Sesostris. Many upright stones were of phallic significance. Belief in these symbols was widespread and so strong that it yet survives even to this day in remote places such as the eastern moorlands. But life is twofold. Male and female created he, them. Our stone triangles were probably erected as symbols of the triune mother goddess. Such is the one type. There is also the upright, the phallus, of which the Rudstone monolith is an upstanding example. The tallest monolith in the country, if not England, says Elgese. It stands in Rudstone churchyard, 5 miles west of Bridlington, is 25.5 feet high, 3.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet thick at the base. It has been shaped out of a block of grit, the nearest crop of which occurs over 10 miles away. What's that called? The Rudstone monolith. How about you look at that, guys? The Rudstone monolith. Jesus, that's a giant phallic symbol. Vlad's just invited me to join a hangout. I'm in the middle of reading, man. I might join that. I'll see how long I'll do this for. But there's the Rudstone monolith. That's what I'm saying, guys. Everything that he says in the book exists. He's no talking. He's just no making this stuff up. 26 foot high. Let's see. The Rudstone monolith at over 7.5 metres, 25 feet, is the tallest megalith standing stone in the United Kingdom. It is situated in the churchyard in the village of Rudstone, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. The stone is slender with 2 large flat faces, approximately 1.75 metres wide and just under 1 metre thick. The top appears to have been broken off the stone. If pointed, the stone would originally have stood about 8.5 metres. In 1773 the stone was capped in lead. This was later removed, though the stone is currently capped. The weight is estimated at 40 tonnes. The monolith is made of gritstone. The nearest source for the stone, Caton or Cornelian Bay, is 9.9 miles north of the site, although it may have been brought naturally to the site as a glacial erratic. The monument dates to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. A possible fossilised dinosaur footprint is said to be on one side of the stone, though a study by English Heritage in 2015 concluded that this claim was unsubstantiated. So guys, it's another new thing I've learnt today. I never knew this was the biggest standing stone in Britain. Yep, you learn something new every day. The churchyard is itself circular, was apparently long ago a pagan site, and the ancients who had evidently carted this immense stone, like those conveyed in a prehistoric age to Stonehenge, must have had some very definite purpose in doing so. It may be that the Rudstone monolith, like the other relics mentioned by the Elgies, was related to the conquest of Sesostris, bearing in mind that the Britain of antediluvian days was divided into several states, some hostile to one another. On his return home, continues Herodotus, Sesostris, bringing with him a host of prisoners, was met on the borders of Egypt at Pelusium by his treacherous brother, who gave a banquet in his honour at Daphne, where he attempted to murder the king by incendiarism. The prisoners of the pharaoh were forced to drag huge masses of stone for the temple of Ptah at Memphis, and also to dig canals in connection with this great system of division of the land. He was only king of Egypt who also reigned over Ethiopia, or Cush, or Chaldea. Diodorus, in his account of the Desullian flood, which he places on the borders of Oceanus, says that Osiris at this time was marching into Ethiopia, and adds that he was also named Egyptus. The inference we may draw from these traces is that Sesostris, Arthur, and Osiris were considered to have been one and the same. Additional light on the personality of Sesostris seems to be thrown by the classical historian Orosius, whose work Alfred the Great translated from Latin into the Saxon tongue, calling him Vizoges, king of Egypt. He states that he conquered Asia, originally named for the European continent, marched his army into the northern parts of Scythia, and was pursued in return by the Scythians, who laid Egypt waste. This sequel, in which the Scythians paid back the invading king of Egypt in his own coin, is that spoken of by Jordanus, the historian of the Goths, in his work De Rubis Getigus. He speaks of the enforced emigration at a certain undefined but very clearly early period of a great body of Goths from Skansa, Scandinavia, the primordial home, led by the prophet Zalmoxis, and that on the river Tana Fjord, and river on the borders of Scandinavia and Lapland. The Goths waged desperate war against the husbands of the Amazons and met the Egyptians in battle, whom they afterwards pursued into Egypt. This account tallies with the invasion of the same Scythian lands by Sesostris, and moreover the mention of Zalmoxis, who appears to have been the classical version of Moses, given a consistent line on this period and on the after events of the reign of Sesostris. On these overseas adventures, Sesostris may be believed to lead his fleet and army by sea from Somerset and Severn along the English Channel, the Erythraean Sea, to have conquered the countries where Holland and Hanover now exist, then to have passed up the eastern shores of Britain by Yorkshire and Scotland, and on his second expedition to have crossed into the Baltic Sea, defeating the various peoples or accepting homage, until he reached the Gulf of Bothnia, where he encountered the Scythians, or emigrant Goths, who were frequently claimed as identical, Jordanes himself says that the Goths who emigrated under Zalmoxis became Scythians. We learn further from Herodotus that some of the soldiers of Sesostris, possibly those left behind in his hurried retreat from the northernmost parts, formed a colony at Colchis, later placed in Russian Iberia, famed as the goal of the Argonauts in their epic search for the Golden Fleece, the site of which may be placed conjecturally in the vicinity of Kolko in Latvia. In all these matters, to reach an understanding, we must look to the north, and not in the direction of the Black Sea, as the history of the Goths indicates, and find confirmation in other directions, including the Old Testament itself. In these same Scythian or Russian lands dwelt the Parthians, descendants of the Medes, both of whom were classically indifferently as Scythians by later writers, but Parthian meant exile, were the original Goths, and we may be probably trace their settlement in Perthshire, also according to Waddell to other parts of Britain as well. The Scythians, who entered and remained in Scotland, were Scotai, Scots, hence they had been Cimmerian, became Scythia, as Herodotus says. And it's funny, guys, because apparently, at least, I think it's something like 80% of Scotsmen have this small bit of DNA from these parts, Scythia. And funnily enough, I got my DNA tested, and although I was 97% European, and 87% was British Isles, I had a 3% from the Caucasus mountain regions, which apparently I think the Scythians were from. Weird. The Scots possess, indeed, a curious reference to the Egyptian pharaoh's activities in the north of the ancient Scots Chronicle, which says, "Ye pectus war chast out your Eowyn lands, cullet Scythia, being ein prince of Egypt, cullet Agenor." And what that means, this is Scotch. It says, "You pectus war chased out of your own lands, call it Scythia, be own prince of Egypt, call it Agenor." The only pharaoh to whom these words could apply is Sesostris. It seems also to fit in with the statement of Jordanes that the Goths arose originally in Scanza, he says, in the north. The Parthian or exiles probably settled in the region of the present Riga, and all these with the others at a period of about the 12th century BC onwards, as Baxter claims in his Glossary of British Antiquities, spread over northern Europe and the British Isles, speaking Gothic, Frisic and Belgic. By his conquests, Sesostris, for a brief period, acquired the hegemony of the ancient world, subduing the fierce peoples to the limits of the Baltic, perhaps for motives which thus far been obscured, but it is as certain as most matters of antiquity that as he sowed the wind, so did he reap the whirlwind. One important phase of his domestic policy must be stressed, namely his astonishing agrarian movement by which he transferred the population in the low-lying valleys to hilltop villages, of which Diodorus gives us the best account. He says that Setheusis divided the country into 36 provinces called nomes, over which he placed nomarchs who had charge of the royal revenues and ruled over nomes. Probably his father Ramses Mayamum had inaugurated this policy, but Setheusis raised many new mounds and transplanted to them the inhabitants of towns situated in valleys, building new hilltop villages and many new canals. In this drastic transfer of population, the soil was portioned out, every man having an equal division, the land being divided up into square or chessboard plots of equal area for all, for which they paid rent in kind, surely a democratic peasant ownership transaction, whereby the hills were cultivated for the first time in many parts. The land belonged entirely to the king, who allotted 1/3 of the revenues to the priests, 1/3 to the soldiers, and retained 1/3 for his own uses. This great work may have been started by his father. We have the biblical references to this policy as operated by Joseph. The account stating that the reason was because of famine, that Pharaoh provided the seeds and took 1/5 of their grains, or say, income tax, to himself. It would appear that this revolutionary undertaking was not completed when Sesostris returned from his conquest, for Diodorus states that the hard taskwork in the cartage of stones for the temple of Ptah and Memphis and the building of canals caused by the Babylonian prisoners to rebel against the king. There exists not a vestige of any such operation in the land we know as Egypt in the south, nor could the arid granite mountain of that country have afforded opportunities of cultivation. In Britain, on the contrary, observed notably in Wiltshire, but embracing not only Wessex but Wales, such a vast homogeneous operation was performed in the late Bronze or early Iron Age. Mr. O.G.S. Crawford, former archaeological officer of the Ordnance Survey, has described these remarkable discoveries in the field of archaeology in his work entitled Air Survey and Archaeology, for this immense system only became discernible when he surveyed from the air, as fully illustrated in his work. It clearly reveals traces of former extensive habitations on hilltop sites, with chessboard fields of equal area to one another, all one concerted movement, he says, in obvious obedience to some central authority. I now append an epitome of his detailed description of these hilltop villages. So the next part is going to be the Celtic hilltop prehistoric system. I'm going to have a 5-minute break, people. I'll be back in a minute. A 5-minute break. I'll be back in a minute. What an idiot. Right, guys, I'll be back soon. Right, people, hope you're having a good night. Well, a quick look in chat, see who's in. I know my book reading isn't the most interesting, but this kind of stuff interests me. And after I read the book, I'm going to do my own research, because I do think the Celtic culture started in the British Isles rather than in Central Europe. I think the guy's onto a lot of good stuff. Like, I'm not too sure about the whole connection with the Bible, but he's linking up. He's definitely linking up certain places. Anyway, where was I? The Celtic hilltop prehistoric. Oh, wait there, I was going to check the chat, sorry. Let's see. Itchy from Austin. Andretzi. P. Mars. Wombra. Wasn't expecting a full house tonight. This is from myself. This is my own archive. This is my own research. Reading a book gets me used to saying these long, strange Greek words. I'm not too bad at the British Celtic words, and some of them are a bit tricky. The Welsh ones are tricky, but the Greek ones are the trickiest. Anyway, Celtic hilltop prehistoric system. Over Wiltshire and Hampshire, air survey has proved that all the then lie-lowing villages had been removed from the valleys and were rebuilt on the tops of hills. In some instances, artificial heights had been erected for the purpose, and then other additional heights were added. Diodorus, many new mounds. These hilltop villages were provided with turf walls, paths, boundary ditches, drainage channels, and where the water was not conveniently situated, with dew ponds. The new cultivation system was put into operation by dividing the hillsides into square plots of chessboard pattern, but where the terrain required it, some were oblong, yet each occupied the same area. The hills for the cultivation were terraced, locally called lynchets, thus dividing up the plots down the hillsides. This network of lynchets, boundary banks, and the roads or tracks formed an organic system in conjunction with the upland villages and with the building of the canals or ditches below. It was a homogeneous operation. The unity which marks the system as an epoch occurred in the early Iron Age, but some villages yield traces of the Bronze or even Neolithic periods. Later invaders, the Belgae or Saxons, occurred after an hiatus. They entirely changed the pre-existent Celtic system for the fields cut right across the previous Celtic design. They never used hilltop villages, but dwelt by streams and parcelled out the land differently, generally crossing at totally different angles. The Saxons alluded to the ancient inhabitants as giants. The Romans had nothing to do with the Celtic system. Not one single relic found in the Celtic upland settlements reveals Roman traces. 8. The same Celtic system was apparently operated simultaneously not only over the Wessex country but also over Wales and parts of Ireland. Will anybody venture to call this a coincidence? If not, we possess important circumstantial evidence that Sesostris, king of Egypt, reigned over large parts of Britain, and that we shall not be wrong if, taking the existence of this Celtic system where it has been found to operate, it defines the original Egyptian lands. Here we have the homogeneous policy directed from one single centre, and I suggest from the Avalon, with its hilltop villages, its chest-shaped fields, supplied with canals or ditches, just as the account of Diodorus explains. It happened in the early Iron Age, which may be said to gather support from the mystic initiations in which King Arthur was concerned. And then, all this was followed by a hiatus. Who were the Saxons that arrived some time after all this operation had been perfected and transferred from the former system to quite another? Foreign invaders? Saxons? Yes. But as we shall see, the so-called Israelites who came with Moses and Joshua were Sakai or Saxons on the authority of the Bible, which is read by most without any perspicacity and so ignored. Perspicacity. What word's that? Have a look at this word. Perspicacity. 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 Never heard that word in my life. Perspicacity.
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 Perspicacity. Perspicacity. Perspicacity. The quality of having a ready insight into things. Shrewdness. Perspicacity.
Perspicacity.
Interesting. Perspicacity. Don't know if I'll use that word again, like. Jesus. Anyway. Where was I? Right. Obviously, Mr. Crawford, in writing his description of these upland villages in the Celtic system, so exactly in consonance with Diodorus, Herodotus, and Genesis, had not the slightest idea that he was uncovering the entire Sesostris system, and that in doing so he in fact tears up all the laborious efforts to pretend that Egypt and the Israelite lands belonged geographically to these Near East, so that all the prestige of the past glories assumed by these countries and in our present modern days leading to political claims based on false premises is utterly and entirely untrue. The truth is that the ancient Britons embraced the Egyptians and Hebrews, Iberes, while the Assyrians were the Saxons. But let us return to Sesostris. Why did he embark on this determined invasion of the northern lands which he sowed the seeds of ultimate disaster? Why did he build these hilltop villages and order the people to cultivate them on the hillsides, where the different levels were ruled off into lynchets, yet seen so many hillsides in Wessex, where once flourished olives and the grapevine? Why this anxiety to erect phallic symbols in the countries he defeated? I think these answers can be supplied when we realise the age in which he lived, the threats hanging over him, and that he was a pious and chivalrous monarch, the last great ruler or god-king of the 19th Ramses dynasty, and who was in fact killed at the time of the Great Catastrophe, to be subsequently, with a revision of the religious cult, defied as a judge of the underworld at Amenta, where it is probable he really met with his end, and became the god Osiris. There is evidence contained in the work of Manetho which appears to indicate that he was forewarned of a coming catastrophe, and it is possible, to say the least of it, that his policy of moving his people to heights and was influenced and hastened by his foreknowledge. It is also not unlikely that this premonition caused him to raise the phallic symbols, being an extremely pious man, to remind mankind of the dangers that lay ahead, for the phallus was a representation of the destructive deity, because a comet or a meteor approaching the earth and striking bears such a giant resemblance to the male organ, while the Asherah in effect represented Mother Earth. Borrow relates a very curious tradition held by the Spanish gypsies of Extremadura, which gives a garbled version of the conquest of the pharaoh in question. Although he is not mentioned by name, it is worth relating because it throws a strong light upon the circumstances of the period under discussion. There was a king of Egypt, and his name was Pharaoh. He made numerous armies, which he made war on all countries and conquered them all. And when he had conquered the whole world, he became sad and sorrowful, for as he delighted in war, he no longer knew on what to employ himself. At last he bethought him to make war on God, so he sent a defiance to God, daring him to descend from the sky and contend with Pharaoh and his armies. God was incensed against Pharaoh and resolved to punish him. He opened a hole in the side of a mountain and raised a raging wind and drove before it Pharaoh and his armies, and the abyss received him, and the mountain closed on them. But whoever goes to that mountain on the night of St. John's Day can hear Pharaoh and the armies singing and yelling. And it came to pass that when Pharaoh and his armies had disappeared, all the kings of the nations who had become subject to Pharaoh revolted, and having lost her king and her armies, she left utterly without defence, and they made war against her, and took her people and drove them forth, dispersing them all over the world. There is a great deal of truth in this narrative despite the hyperbole, such being as an essential to be remembered and preserved when tradition was oral. The defiance to God is a variation of the Greek legend of the giants who challenged the gods and piled Pelion on Ossa and Ossa on Olympus in order to reach Zeus, a fable I suggest derived from the hilltop villages and the artificial mounds used by Sesostris in his policy. The account gives us a sidelight on the great catastrophe, including the death of Pharaoh himself. It describes the aftermath of the eclipse of the Atlantean Egypt. There is yet another aspect of this really wonderful period of the world, and especially British prehistory. The new cultivatation system, as Crawford describes the hilltop village policy, was one of the virtues ascribed to Osiris, that good man who was reputed to have taught the Egyptians the use of agriculture. I have no record to show of King Arthur's reputation in that respect, except we have the indelible traces of the upland system in the parts of which he must have ruled. But Sesostris' passion for raising monoliths or great stones was shared by Arthur and also the fabulous Memnon. Who was a mysterious Memnon? Herodotus goes out of his way to state that Memnon was not an Egyptian, which suggests that others held an opposite view. At all events, Memnon was king of Ethiopia, and so was Sesostris, as well as of Egypt, and like the latter, he erected upright sacred stones called Memonia, and after him, a word corresponding to the Gaelic menhir, and he was said to have raised them in various countries, also in Egypt. We know of the famous statue of Memnon in the temple of Luxor, which, when struck by the first rays of the rising sun, was said to have emitted a note like the snapping of a cord. Does not our own Byron allude to the Ethiop king, whose statue turns a harper once a day? That statue is still pointed out at Luxor, one of the two colossi, with numerous Greek and Latin inscriptions scrawled upon it, in the belief that it was Memnon's statue. It is said never to snap in modern times, but if that statue had been erected to Memnon, why was he represented merely as one of the two colossi? The setting up of sacred stones by Sesostris, Memnon, and also King Arthur, of which many traditionally survive in Wales and Ireland, relating, it would seem, to the period shortly before the great catastrophe, may have been an invocation to that important meteor sender, the Egyptian Hercules or Tyrian Melqarth. Was it not Hercules who was enlisted by the gods to destroy the invading giants? Arthur's name was peculiarly associated with the great menhirs and with the cromlechs in Wales, Wessex and Scotland. Such were not believed to be living stones, but to be able to speak on occasions and to possess a mystical and even medicinal value, as the seer Merlin was said by Geoffrey of Monmouth to have told Aurelius, king of Britain, when Merlin proposed that he should send to Mount Calirius, Giant's Causeway, for the giants' dance stones of Stonehenge. They are mystical stones and of medicinal value, he declared. There is not a stone there which has not some healing virtue. In Irish legendary are several instances of such stones, like the stones of speculation, from which fire could be kindled, and a similar idea inspired the veneration of the Pillars of Hercules, as also for the monoliths of Avebury, attributed to the hero god. And what more too bold when he associates Arthur himself with the name of Melqarth, to wit. It can hardly be doubted that the bardic poetry of later times associated Arthur with the god Hercules, whose 12 tasks are perverted to the story of the 12 battles of Arthur. Hercules, originally Melqarth, may even have furnished the name of the British hero, Melk, King Arth. Arthur's stone of Cefn Bryn Gower is a cromlech of 8 perpendicular stones terminating in small points, on which rests a 9th stone weighing about 20 tons. Under it there is a spring called Lady's Well. If Hercules represented divine fire, it is well to recall that the Druids knew of 2 kinds of fire, one Dislanach, God's lightning, and Dru Lanach, Druid's lightning. Can we be certain that the Druids did not find it convenient to pass off the one as the other when it suited them, seeing that their strength rested mainly on the claim to possess supernatural powers? In the foregoing, I have shown much closely how figures of Sesostris, the great Egyptian monarch, the origin of Osiris and King Arthur, are interwoven, whether we call the sacred city of their main activities in the underworld cult by the name of Memphis or Avalon. Indeed, as already shown, they conjoin in the city situated on an island placed in the region of swamps. They are both great national leaders whose lives were dramatic and spectacular, both conquerors whose end was tragic. Both were buried in the city where they were believed to have died or else risen from the dead. And to cap the foregoing, both were irrevocably mixed up with the use or development of magic power in the land subsequently devastated by a great catastrophe. In symbolism, they may have said to agree in many ways, for King Arthur, like Osiris, became deified in the opinion of many Celtic scholars. Spence contends on evidence he adduces that Arthur became who, and that he was hailed as the supreme proprietor of the Isle of Britain, symbolised by the ox, much as the Apis bull represented Osiris. So that's where maybe the bull worship comes from, the ox worship. It's Glastonbury. A star map of the zodiacal giants of Somerset. Nor let us lose sight of the fact that the sacred city was deemed to have lain in the heart of paradise. It was termed the Isle of the Blessed. Its sanctity was based on a high state of civilization, of an intimacy with the deity apart from the material power. If it were the veritable great gate of heaven, as Jacob pronounced Bethel to be, the very seat of the Lord, and as successive generations believed unquestionably it to be, was it contingent only on that patriarch's dream? Was there any other reason? Not long ago, a remarkable theory was published in the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada by Mrs. K. E. Maltwood. Her contention being that in some long distant time, certain astronomers laid out a gigantic zodiac among the little hills surrounding Glastonbury, which answers to the first mighty labour of the Isles of Britain, on which the Welsh bards sang, she says, "It has rested prone on the heights for thousands of years, concealed with King Arthur's fabled mantle of invisibility, though seeing everyone." The sophistication of this design of the round table of the stars, explains the writer, proves that it was planned by experts who cleverly adapted the configuration of the surrounding terrain, and she continues in these words. During thousands of years of zodiac was so much revered that every figure there portrayed was a sacred emblem. For instance, the four evangelistic symbols of the bull, lion, man and bird are found here in the Somerset in the proper places at the four cardinal points, i.e. Taurus, Leo, Sagittarius and Aquarius, whereas on modern maps there is no bird amongst the zodiacal constellations. Temples, as we understand them, were not great enough to contain the constellations, so Mother Nature was chosen to sustain them, and the 30-mile circumference of the sacred area was looked upon in its beginning as the cauldron of unfailing supply. We are told by the Welsh bards, the descendants of the Cymry, that it was stolen from the divine land, for it was the Anwen itself. Taliesin, who knew about it, sings of the spoils of Anwen, of the recovery by Arthur of the magic cauldron of inspiration, and that it was found at Ser Sidi, the zodiac. The terrain of this immense zodiac is surrounded on three sides by hills rising up 1,000 feet and crowned in many cases by prehistoric forts. On its west flows the Severn Sea, or Bristol Channel, and within the great natural enclosure the low-lying hills give the outline of the figures, which are governed to a great extent by the course of two small rivers penned in by hills from the most ancient times. In examining this plan, the figures of the zodiac are seen to be arranged that they converge towards Avalon, not far from the centre of the circle, an amazing achievement, seeing that some of them exceed an area of 3 miles in length. Mrs. Maltwood claims that at the time this territorial zodiac was devised, Leo and Scorpio were doubled the size and proportion than as now represented in the star maps, so that Leo occupies the position of Cancer as well as his own, and Scorpio that of Libra, which suggest a very ancient design, yet one which apparently continued for many long moons. North of the circle are the winter months, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricornus, Aquarius and Pisces, as well as Cetus, the whale or amphibious monster. In the southern halves are Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Leo and Virgo. Aquarius, the water bearer, is represented by the phoenix, holding the water in his beak and fanning the burning nest with his outstretched wings. The writer contends that the famous Isle of Avalon, towering 600 feet out of the marsh, forms this fabulous bird, and the urn it carries contains the life-giving blood spring, known far and wide as Chalice Well. Its waters are radioactive and stain the stones over which it flows blood red. In the same writer's opinion, this immense zodiac should solve the problem of when, where and how the constellations were first designed, and which she attributes to Hugh Gardner. Whether or no it is evidence to all students of astronomical symbology that when the wise men divided up the signs of the zodiac from selected groups of stars in the universe, groups through which the sun passed in his annual passage, they selected arbitrary figures to suit some especial and particular purpose. In other words, the stars that denote Taurus bear no real resemblance to a bull, or those of Leo to a lion, and so on, yet there was some evident motive for such a decision. It may have been that the contours of the terrain around Avalon naturally accorded them the shapes which seemed to invite immortality in a star map. The selection of the phoenix with the urn to represent Avalon may lend itself to a suggestion that it was here for the astronomers first discovered the Sothic cycle of 1461 years, or, as I contended in my previous work, originally of 1440 years before the Great Catastrophe or flood altered the orbit of the Earth by lengthening it to 365 and a quarter days from a previous of 360 days. So the author thinks that this meteor that hit the Earth knocked it off rotation. We are told from ancient records that after the flood, Hermes, representing the druidic genius, revised the zodiac and calendar, and assuming the fact of this vast zodiac, we appear to look on a solar design laid out long before the period of the Great Catastrophe, and that Avalon, the heart of it, originally gave us the zodiacal signs. In concluding this investigation into the remote past in relation to the events immediately preceding the flood or Great Catastrophe, an inquest whereby many famous biblical cities and sites in Wessex have been identified, as I contend, especially noting Somerset and that ancient seat of mankind, the Isle of Avalon, the reason why this should have been the focus of activity in prehistoric times is, I suggest, apparent. It lay in the heart of the ancient ore mining region, particularly of copper and tin, hence bronze, when the ancient world was narrow and circumscribed. In addition to being an ideal maritime centre with its Severn, Avon and inland sea, the Auxella, it was the scene of the first settlement of the Atlanteans at Gades, later Tarshish, now identified with the region of Bristol Port. It brought Cadmus and Cilix in search of Europe, the West, as it was attracted Abram or Hugh Gardner like a magnet, in search of those invaluable metals which granted the owner power. It is no answer to ever that copper, tin, iron and other ores could be and were discovered elsewhere, because in the earlier times they remained unknown to the northern Aryans, and in any case were far overseas when sailing in uncharted seas, which must necessarily have been a hazardous undertaking. Speaking of bronze itself, the conjuity of both copper and tin strongly presupposed that here the value of that alloy was first of all discovered in the local foundries. Somerset accordingly was a prehistoric El Dorado of those who wished to procure and manufacture arms. I have said comparatively little in regard to the prehistoric science and weapons, including firearms, although it is manifest that they played the most vital part in ancient power politics, as we term it in modern days, and the possession of the knowledge of the metallurgy must have been one of the most urgent yet secret objects on the part of those who desired to rule the ancient world. Somerset became in consequence the centre of invasion and later of wars by others who desired to acquire the hegemony of the ancient world, notably the Assyrians. Avalonia, as the first scientific centre of the power of Abraham and later of the Ramses kings, was arena of the final battles before the great catastrophe destroyed the main part of its high civilization, as described in the book of Enoch and by the prophet Ezekiel, who says that Egypt shall be utterly waste and desolate and uninhabitable for 40 years, never to recover her former power. Here took place, by all accounts, the climax of the 13 years' war between the gods and the giants, the region where his anointed, in the book of Enoch, the last of the great Egyptian or British kings, frenziedly prepared weapons to defeat the oncoming threat. To that aspect I shall now return in the next part of this research. I conclude this portion with the sad reflection that wars have apparently been always based, whatever the pretext, on the ambitions of rulers to acquire domination and wealth by accumulating weapons which give them predominance over all others, and the neglect or inability of others to defend themselves. It is essentially true of our own times, and I fear likely to exist to the end of time. The world never, alas, learns from the past, and recognises the menace of tyrants too late. Part 3, the climax. So I might read this for half an hour. Very few Bible students have devoted the necessary tune to a search for parallel events related in what is termed profane history. Unfortunately for the progress of truth, clerical influences tend to suppress the publication of any evidence which is seen to be in conflict with the scriptural accounts. E. Jessel, unknown historian of the Jews. Investigations into the beginnings of religion have accumulated steadily throughout the past half-century. It is only by great efforts of censorship by sectarian education of an elaborately protected sort and the like that ignorance about them is maintained. H. G. Wells, The Fate of Homo Sapiens. So what page is this, guys? This is part 3. 106. That's at 160. I'll read part 3 of this. Right, here's part 3. Have a quick drink. Wet the old palate. Amenophis, the last pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, who, has been indicated, corresponds with the Sesostris of Diodorus and Herodotus, reigned for nearly 20 years according to Manetho. His was an intensely dramatic era which culminated in a prolonged war, the invasion of his country by vast and well-armed hordes, accompanied by meteorological events of a phenomenal character, and finally ended in the great catastrophe which destroyed him and most of his nation. He was the pharaoh of the Exodus, a period of world unrest in which Moses, the real creator of the Jewish faith, organised revolt inside Egypt and brought powerful forces from outside to defeat and overthrow Pharaoh and his people. Manetho, it will be recalled from earlier description, tells how the Hyksos, the original Israelites, who occupied the lands of Mizraim, were expelled from these territories in the 8th year of King David, when they quitted Hebron and the Egyptian lands and moved to Jerusalem, after having lorded it over the Egyptians in the southwest for 511 years. Manetho then explains the period of the death of Amenophis, 327 years later. His list of the Ramses kings forming the 18th and 19th dynasties over this stretch of time is as follows. So Tethmosis or Tuthmosis, Chebron, Amenophis, Amesis, Mephres, Mephra, Tethmosis, Amenophis, Orus, Akinacres, Rathotus, Akinseres, Akinseres II, Armaeus, Ramses I, Ramses II, and Amenophis III. The average length of reigns of these 17 monarchs is a trifle over 19 years, quite a normal period, and it comprises a precise list, for even the months are included. If we synchronise this period of 327 years with the kings of Judah, those of the separate kingdom of Israel have more than one interregnum. We find that the 8th year of David we reach the 14th year of Hezekiah. During the first 13 years of reign, untoward events took place, especially relating to the land of Egypt. The Old Testament does not give months in the reigns of the kings of Judah, the rule being that if a reign lasted for 6 months or over, it counted as a year, whereas if under 6 months, the year was ignored. It was a rough and ready method, but not so wrong on average as might be expected, only 2 years difference if we synchronise it with the 14th of Hezekiah, as for certain reasons appears to have been the case. In this period, 15 kings had reigned, and Hezekiah still reigning, making the 16th against the 17th Ramses pharaohs. For comparison, I give the Judean list. David, after quitting Hebron, 32 years, Solomon, 40 years, Rehoboam, 17 years, Abijam, 3 years, Asa, 41 years, Jehoshaphat, 25 years, Jehoram, 8 years, Ahaziah, is that a year? Queen Athaliah, 6, Jehoash, 40, Amaziah, 29, Azariah, 52, Jotham, 16, Ahaz, 6, first 13 years of Hezekiah, 13, total 329. The difference may be attributed to the discrepancy in the Judean method, 2 years in all compared with the Manetho's list. Such then is the synchronization, but on the present system of the Old Testament, with its chaotic chronology, it appears impossible to reconcile such a contingency as to make Hezekiah contemporaneous with the Pharaoh of the Exodus and the prophet Moses. That Amenophis lived in the earlier years of the 14th century BC is confirmed by astronomy, namely by the Sothic cycle, which was named after him as the Epoch of Menophris and occurred in 1322 BC. Albeit our modern Egyptologists have so far improved on Manetho's list as to give him a date of 1233 to 1223 BC, a century later, thus ignoring the Sothic cycle. Hezekiah, by Old Testament chronology, lived some 6 centuries later than the date as compared with Manetho. The subject of ancient chronology has always been a vexed question, but to avoid a long digression, it will be more convenient to give particulars of this synchronization elsewhere. The very first years of Hezekiah's reign were anxiousness to the rulers of Judea because of the growing menace of Assyria and her allies. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, king of Israel, the first of Hezekiah, there came against him the Assyrian monarch Shalmaneser or Sargon from Nineveh, with various allies and tributaries who looted the country and forced Hoshea to pay tribute. Previous to this invasion, Ahaz, king of Judah, worsted in his wars against the Samaritan government, and the Syrians of Damascus had whetted the appetite of the Assyrians by appealing to Tiglath-Pileser or Pul for aid, who was only too pleased to come across to the Euphrates and pillage. In the 6th year, Hoshea was accused by Shalmaneser of conspiring with So, king of Egypt, and was thrown into prison. while Samaria, which shut her gates on the enemy, was besieged for 3 years and suffered untold miseries, until finally the Inchoate kingdom of Israel collapsed, her survivors being taken as slaves and sold in the cities of Medes and elsewhere. The same Shalmaneser reputedly invaded Syria and failed to capture the fortress of Tyre. Behind these invasions lay always the implied threat to Egypt, as is shown by Shalmaneser's treatment of Hoshea, who had asked Pharaoh for aid, and his savage destruction of Hoshea's capital. Before long, Egypt in turn fell beneath the heel of the conqueror, and the story of her eclipse is yet to be told in full. But during the period we have the sayings of the great contemporaneous prophet Isaiah. Egypt was apparently leaderless, and her sovereignty had departed, for they were under the thraldom. Thrown over are the words used of a cruel lord and a fierce king who ruled over them. Who were these two men? The answer to Rabshakeh as a cruel lord and to Shalmaneser, or more probable to his son and successor Sennacherib as the fierce king. Egypt was disorganized. They were quarrelling among themselves, city opposed to city, kingdom to kingdom, the while they sought vainly for help from their oracles, wizards, and witches. The princess of Zon, continues the prophet, had become fools. Those of Noph, No or Noamon, were deceived and had led Egypt astray. The land of Judah had become a terror unto Egypt. Words perhaps explained by the movements of Moses as described by Manetho, to which we shall arrive shortly. The Lord, in short, would smite Egypt, and that day shall be a highway out of Egypt into Assyria, and the Assyrians shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. We may read into the expressions a situation in which Egypt had drifted into a state of anarchy and despair, her king either having fled or being unable to stave off defeat, and the rulers threatened or overawed. Although that may not entirely explain the situation which seems to have developed. Strange phenomena were evidently taking place in the heavens above. There was a terrible drought, and waters failed from the sea. The great river of Egypt, understood, dried up like brooks. Reeds and flax withered, and fish disappeared or died. This extraordinary period is referred to in the book of Enoch in these words: And in the days of the sinners, the years, months shall be shortened. Their seed shall be tardy on the lands and fields. All things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time. The rain shall be kept back, and heaven shall withhold it. Nor were these only phenomena which terrified the people of that period, or, probably a little later, the moon shall alter her order, and shall not appear in her due time. In these days the sun shall rise in the evening, as a great chariot journey to the west, causing distress as it goes. It shall shine more brightly than accords with its order of light. And many chief stars shall transgress their prescribed order, and these shall alter their orbits, and not appear at the seasons proper to them. And evil shall be multiplied upon the sinners, and punishment shall come upon them, so as to destroy all. It is inadmissible in these present times to accept any statement that the sun itself could rise in the evening, but an approaching commentary body might give such an illusion, and that such did occur is confirmed by Isaiah in circumstances to be examined later. The writer of Enoch, in his allusions to the sun as resembling a great chariot, calls to remind again the myth of Phaeton, who stole the horses and chariots of the sun. His father Helios swept down so close to the earth that Zeus was forced to hurl him into the river Eridanus in the Cimmerian lands to prevent the whole world from being destroyed by fire. How can we explain the analogy of the sun or a cometary body as resembling a chariot? The answers may be sought in the strange designs on sculptured stones of Scotland, long prehistoric like Gallspey stone, the dice stone, and others which symbolise a twin comet as two wheels with an axle linked them, described by archaeologists as spectacles, possibly an illusion caused by atmospherics, although twin comets have been observed by astronomers in modern times. Such are aspects of the celestial phenomena observed during this period, accompanied by extreme drought. Before I pass from this to the next point in this extraordinary period, mention may be made of that very ancient collection of legends related to the Antichrist era, from the apocryphal sources by the French savant Bossuet. He describes among other features of that age the drought. When there was no rain, the rivers dried up, the land lay arid, birds died, and wives could not obtain no food for their progeny. Later comes the climax, with a fiery chariot and a brand are beheld in the skies. A sword falls from heaven, and a great star burns up the ocean, followed by a fiery storm which lasts 40 days, in which the fire consumes earth and water, the period when the angel made Egypt desolate. With all this occurred the flood. At this point it will be appropriate to return to Manetho and examine his description of the plight in which Egypt found herself at the same period, or a little before the culmination of circumstances. He records that Amenophis, desirous of becoming the spectator of the gods like Horus, one of his human predecessors as the monothic list states, communicated his desire to a seer of the same name of himself. I suggest that the inner meaning of this occult suggestion is wrapped up in the underworld cult, as was previously examined in relation to King Arthur. The seer that may have been allowed to see the gods if he would clear the country of the lepers and impure people who infest it. Accordingly, the Pharaoh sent 80,000 of these unwanted, or, as described, polluted persons to work in the quarries and be segregated from the Egyptians. And where there were quarries situated, and where were these quarries situated? They were at Avaris or Abaris, shown previously as our own Avebury, and where such quarries of stone still remain at least in part. The anxiety of Amenophis to see the gods compares with the veiled bardic accounts of Arthur's visits to the underworld, so intimately related to Avalon. Arthur says Mr. Spence, like Osiris, was the god of a mystical cult who must periodically take a journey through the underworld, and might perhaps be more materialistically explained by suggesting that Amenophis was anxious to discover how far he could rely on the service of the Kibiri priests in respect of arms. The seer also named Amenophis, we are told, learned that some priest who had been sent to Avaris with these undesirables were leprous, and he became alarmed lest the gods should be irate with Pharaoh and himself if any violence were offered to the unwanted peoples. This fear of what the gods might inflict on the Egyptians is contained in another passage of very serious import. Certain people would come to the assistance of these polluted wretches, would conquer Egypt and keep it in their possession for 13 years. However, he durst not tell the king of these things, but left a letter behind him about all those matters, and then slew himself, which made the king disconsolate. The seer would seem to have been attained the occult information of coming events of a highly dangerous character to the independence of Egypt, so much so that he committed suicide. His information caused Pharaoh anxiety as well as it might. Manetho then continues. After those that were sent to work in the quarries had continued in that miserable state for a long while, the king was desired that he would set apart the city of Aris, which was then left desolate by the shepherds, the Hyksos, for their habitation and protection, which desire he granted them. Now this city, according to the ancient theology, was Typhon city, but when these men were gotten into it and found the place ready for revolt, they appointed a ruler out of the priests of Heliopolis, whose name was Osaraph, and they took their oaths that they would be obedient to him in all things. When he was gone over to these people, his name was changed, and he was called Moses. It has been made abundantly clear from what has been earlier advanced in this book that Abaris or Avaris was the original Israelite Hebron, probably represented today by Barbary Castle, north of Avebury, and that the British settlement below it, covering a considerable area, adjoining the immense quarry of monolithic stones, was a meditative capital named Ramah, having been established by Abram son of Ram, the Ramah, which city, after the defeat and expulsion of the tribes under David, had been renamed Ramses by their victors some 340 years previously. Ramses was the starting point of those Israelites and others of the Exodus who were led away for a time by Moses after the 10th plague, having despoiled or robbed the Egyptians' dwellings there. Manetho is therefore given his version of the circumstances preceding the Exodus, and if his testimony be acceptable, it proves that Amenophis was part of the pharaoh of that very mysterious epoch at the time that part of the world was grievously affected by phenomenal meteorological conditions. Moses is depicted as a priest of Heliopolis, Egyptian On, who became the leader of the ensuing insurrection. And it's funny, guys, after seeing that hurricane, is it Irma? Is it Hurricane Irma, the name? There's that many happening right now. But one of the Caribbean islands, I think for half a day, the sea went right out. The tide went right out for half a day. You could walk on the sand. The sea was so far out, the hurricane had taken the water away. I think it came back eventually after a day. But it reminds you the biblical story of Moses splitting the Red Seas. And if there was these things happening at the time, all these catastrophes, well, maybe Moses didn't split the Red Sea. Maybe the sea was already split because of these catastrophes that were happening, these meteorological events. Manetho continues the account by stating that Moses made the outcasts or slaves in the quarries swear obedience to his commands. They were told that they must eschew the Egyptian deities, even to slay all the sacred animals which the Egyptians worshipped, and he also ordered them to erect new walls about Avaris in order to prepare for a war against Pharaoh. If this were the case, there is little wonder if Amenophis said to his own people, "Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them out of the land." He was confronted with the same problem as faces modern nations who open their frontiers too widely to aliens, friendly or otherwise, who can undermine the independence and soul of a great nation. He wanted them out of his country, not as the book of Exodus represents him, a hard-hearted tyrant who forced them to remain against their will. Who were these unwanted people? The book of Exodus says that they were the Israelites, and thus they must have been descendants of those who failed to accompany David long before and had become Egyptianized, in addition to many thousands of others who probably included the Ishmaelites, always described as gypsies or Egyptians, well known for their laziness, sloth, and dirty habits. The seer Amenphis foresaw what might happen only too well. The leader Moses, while making these secret preparations for an uprising against the Egyptian king, sent messengers, we are told, to those who had long before been driven away to Jerusalem, inviting their aid in the war he was hatching, and promising in return to bring them back to their ancient city and country Avaris, and that they would protect and fight for them. Manetho says that they came with the Alacrity some 200,000 strong, although we have reason to believe that the newcomers were not the people of Jerusalem, but a vast horde of Gothic or Scythian invaders who at the time were besieging that city. When the Pharaoh heard of this invasion of his country, he recollected the ill omens of the seer and was greatly confused. He called upon his army, conferred with his chiefs, ordered the priests to remove the sacred animals and the images of gods to safekeeping, and then sent his son Sethos, who was also called Ramses, after his father Ramses, Mayamaman, being but 5 years old, to a friend of his. In another excerpt from Manetho, it says that the infant was concealed in a cave and later avenged his father, having completed those matters. He then passed on with the rest of the Egyptians, being 300,000 of the most warlike of them, against the enemy who met them. Yet did he not join battle with them, but thinking that would be to fight the gods, he returned back, came to Memphis, where he took Apis and other sacred animals, and presently marched into Ethiopia, together with his whole army and multitude of the Egyptians. For the king of Ethiopia was under an obligation to him, who received him and took care of the multitude with him. He also allotted cities and villages for this exile that was to be during those fatally determined 13 years. He pitched a camp for his Ethiopian army as a guard to King Amenophis upon the borders of Egypt. Thus mysteriously did Amenophis quit his beloved country and people, leaving them to the mercy of their rapacious enemies bent on overthrowing it, and retired with his army to the north, although another account suggests that his army deserted him at the critical hour. It sounds unaccountable unless his motive were to obtain help from the Ethiopians, the Kush, to meet this invasion of vast forces from overseas. Yet an army of 300,000 men should have been powerful enough to confront the army. If you recognise that Amenophis was Sesostris and take his previous military campaigns into account when he defeated or rendered tributary so many nations beyond the seas, in which loot does not seem to have been his main purpose, could it be that he was then looking ahead because he had prior information that a great assembly of nations was being roused against him by Moses, who had fled and so endeavoured to take time by the forelock? From Jordanus, from one historian, and from Orosius, for another, we gather there would seem to have been every reason to suspect that within a short time of his last campaign against the Scythians, an apparent abortive campaign, he found himself with weakened resources, assailed by a huge army of invaders, armed with the latest weapons of the age, even though, from a biblical account, the Syrians are mainly mentioned. In other words, did Amenophis' irresolution and apparent cowardice arise from a knowledge that these newcomers possessed arms of a vast calibre which he could not compete? Must not these vast armaments have taken many years to perfect and accumulate? Note that phrase of Manetho, he did not join the battle with them, thinking that it would be to fight against the gods. What gods? Kibiri gods? How far was the man we know as Moses behind this situation? We know from the scriptures that earlier he had fled from Egypt with a price put on his head, and now had returned defiantly to threaten Pharaoh. Apart from the stories in Exodus of how, after each plague, Moses and Aaron visited the king and demanded that he should free the so-called Israelites in avarice, there is a strange account of how Moses and Aaron cast their serpent rods defiantly before Pharaoh seated on his throne, which ate or destroyed the serpent rods of the Egyptian magicians. If you read between the lines, the implication was that he threatened Pharaoh with the superior weapons unless he consented to his demand. Josephus throws a yet clearer light on the subject. He describes how Moses, on his return to Egypt after a long absence, during which time he had been initiated into his new god Jehovah, or Jehovah, was met on the frontier by the chief Hebrews, who at first showed disbelief in some sweeping claims he made, until he produced astonishing signs which ensured their deliverance. What could there have been other than some advanced form of armament? He was led before Pharaoh, from whom he demanded the release of the people he was championing, and to prove his power gave him a similar demonstration. Pharaoh angrily called him an evil man who had formerly run away from Egypt and now returned with deceitful tricks and wonders and magical arts in order to astonish him. His comment may have been caused by chagrin, but the story in Exodus suggests that Moses was able to prove that his magical arts were vastly superior to those of the Egyptians. Not that the Egyptians were without such serpent rods. Is there not a suggestiveness in the account of how Amenophis required to see the gods before he rounded up the unwanted peoples? There is a highly instructive passage of Isaiah where the prophet says, O my people, that dwellest in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrian. He shall smite thee with a rod, and shall lift up his staff against thee, after the manner of Egypt. We also have these words, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hands is mine indignation. A passage which as veiled language appears to denote that with these weapons they punished the shortcomings of those they defeated and destroyed. In analysing the past, I cannot overstress how vital and important is always this problem of weapons. Moses, as I shall attempt to prove, was behind the vast movements of this period with the intention of defeating Egypt, overthrowing her power, and annexing the country for his Scythians, or more notably, Sakai. From the foregoing, the inference I draw is that Amenophis realised later that he could not face the impending invasion with any prospect of success, and decided to retire until such time as he could strengthen his arms. In view of this development, the hitherto inexplicable attitude of the seer Amenophis, as previously cited, may be regarded in another light. If it were he, as the text of Manetho suggests, who was to have initiated Pharaoh into the latest mysteries of the underworld activity, and as to what this signified, we have obtained some information. He stood as an hierophant of the secret cult, and the king's object was to ascertain through Ptah, or his human representative, the latest development of the occult science. For did not seer warn the king that he should be careful not to antagonize the representatives of the enemy's gods, presumably because he had himself learnt the menacing facts about them. So, commencing the 13 years' war and rapine between the gods and the giants described in so many a myth, which directly precede the great catastrophe. It was a war which heralded the destruction of Atlantis, because, as is said in the book of Esdras, the second book is filled with information on the subject of the devices common to the world, added to the earthquakes and uproars of the people of the earth. With the retreat of Amenophis, as told of by Isaiah, the invaders enjoyed a halcyon time. They overran Egypt, pillaged her, demanded heavy tribute from cities, enslaved many, and were accused of savagery and horrid wickedness by Manetho. This wickedness appears to have been the destruction of the images of the gods, and used such as were made of wood to roast the sacred animals which they consumed, and after forcing the priests to become their executioners, ejected them from the country. This is an aspect of the Exodus which does not appear, nor should we expect it to do so, in the scriptures. From the book of Exodus we learn that the Pharaoh, which knew not of Joseph, decided to expel the Hebrews from his dominion. We are told that they were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. There arose this king, who said to his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. And very naturally, it must be said, he preferred their room to their company. If such were the case, the account of refusal to let them go was not in consonance with the story of the plagues and his reiterated refusal to release them, but probably because if released, they would make war on his people, as indeed they did. They escaped in the nick of time. These alleged Israelites, who had bred and multiplied to such an amazing number as to constitute a threat to the Egyptians, can only be explained as the descendants of the original Hyksos, who had stayed behind 327 years previously, who preferred to be subject to the kings of Egypt rather than the march with David to another region. When we are told that the 600,000 persons went out from Ramses with Moses, besides children and a mixed multitude, if they were Israelites, there seems to be no other solution, but it is more than probable they included the Hagarites or Gypsies and many of the invaders. They certainly could not have been the descendants of the few persons who are supposed to have ventured into Egypt in the time of Joseph, only a generation or two back. In any case, Moses wanted these undesirables out of the way for other reasons, and apparently the bulk of them were led to a far distant land. Manetho's account is his version of the circumstances which preceded the Exodus, and if his testimony is acceptable, it definitely proves that Amenophis was the Pharaoh of that period, when the heavens themselves were in a state of chaos by the approaching comet, as shown by the instances of the various plagues, and upset, it would seem, Moses' intentions. It may assist if I give an outline of where these vast hordes were probably led to in the first place. Right guys, I'm going to leave it at that tonight. That's a nice wee marker, the wee stars across there. So what page was that? 171. I'll write that down. Right guys, so I'm getting through this book. It's, like I said, it's still pretty interesting to me, and I'll probably do a couple of videos in between these book reading, but I do want to finish this book. Anyway guys, I'm going to check out Vlad, see what he's up to, and I hope you all have a good night. I'll see you in my next reading. See you later.